I'm Michael Jackson. No, not the one who sings and dances and drinks Pepsi. I write about drink, and judging from the average bookshelf these days, that's a pretty popular pursuit. All sorts of people do it. I have a particular passion for single malt Scotch. It's one of the world's great drinks, and one with a lot of mystique. Perhaps you'll join me in sampling some of these classic malts. There are more than 100 malt distilleries in Scotland, and each makes whisky with the taste of its own location. Each of these classic malts represent the flavour of a different region. These are unblended Scotch whiskies. Each has its own character, and there's one for every mood and every moment. From the malty lowlander, Glenkinchie, to the heathery highlander, Dalwhinnie, from the flowery Speyside, Cragganmore, to the briny westerner, Oban, from the peppery Talisker of Skye, to the peaty Lagavulin of Islay. I enjoy my job. Of course I do. I enjoy it right from the first rituals, the preparations, the expectations. Some of these malts have been waiting 16 years to give of themselves, so I'm not going to be in a hurry. I'm going to savour the moment. As you can see, I've assembled a few bits and pieces to help me with my deliberations. I like to have a white cloth so that I can get a good look at the colour of the whisky. Whisky does look very appetising in the traditional cut glass, with the light refracted through it. But I want to see the colour of the precious spirit itself. And most important, I want to capture the bouquet. You taste with your nose and your eyes as well as your palate. Single malt scotches are very aromatic, and the aroma is a very important part of their character. That's why I use these professional tasting glasses. They curve in at the top to retain the aroma, and they bulge a little in the middle so that I can get a good clear look at the colour. A sherry capita would be ideal, or brandy snifters would do just fine. We'll need some water, and enough for a drink to cleanse the palate between each sampling. Bottled water, no chlorine, and preferably no carbonation to bite the palate. The water doesn't have to be Scottish, but harmony can only help. I don't keep the water in the fridge, nor do I keep my whisky in the fridge, or even use ice, for the simple reason that cold anaesthetises the palate. For clearing the palate, I find that water's quite enough. Some tasters prefer to have biscuits or crackers or bread. I find that they leave a little taste of their own in the mouth afterwards. It's really just a question of personal preference. Oh, and a notebook and a pen, so that our impressions of these wonderful malts don't disappear in a Scotch mist. Now for the big choice. Which whisky? Well, the obvious place to start is with the lightest tasting malt, so that we can progress to those with more intense aromas and palates. And while we're doing that, we'll be making an armchair journey from the lowlands of Scotland to the highlands and onto the islands. As you can see, I've had a bit of a tidy up here, and I've got the bottles in the order in which I'd like to taste the malts. Glenkinchie, Dalwhinnie, Cragganmore, Oban, Talisker and Lagavulin. In itself, that's quite a journey through the great malt-making regions of Scotland. So, let's start. Let's start by nosing. I can't do this if I've got a cold, of course, and tasters avoid aftershaves or perfumes. And no smoking, of course. That goes without saying, but I'll say it anyway. I like to give it a really good nose, and perhaps warm the glass in my hand, just to swirl it a little, just to release the aromas. For the first sample, I nose and taste the whisky neat. You can't taste many in this way at a single session, but I taste it neat so that I can judge the texture and body of the malt. Then I take some water to clear my palate. And I let the whisky take a little water too. That water will help release its aromas. I must say, I not only enjoy sampling, but also drinking my malt in this kind of glass with this tiny dilution. People say, should I really put water into malt whisky? Well, at this stage, definitely yes. Lots of tasters dilute to 50-50. That's why they have these gradations on the side of the glass to measure it. For me, that's just too watery. So how would I describe this malt? It has a light, sweet, grassy aroma, a light to medium body. But what I noticed most of all about Glenkinchie is that grassy sweetness, the grassy sweetness almost of barley that's been malted.
What fruits, usually grapes, are to wines and brandies, grains are to beers and whiskies. Barley is the greatest of these grains, and the only one used in malt whisky. Grapes can simply be crushed, but barley has to be steeped in water, spread out to germinate, then dried in a kiln. This turns the barley into malt, ready to yield up its natural fermentable sugars. In malting, the drying process usually involves a peat fire. It's just the slightest touch of smokiness that gives Glenkinchie its balancing peaty dryness in the finish.
So if every malt has its moment, when would I choose this one? Well, I might reach for a Glenkinchie as a restorative after a country walk, or at the 19th hole if I played golf. Of course, you can drink it any time. No doubt some devotees always ask for a Glenkinchie, but I couldn't order the same malt every time, any more than I could order the same wine with every meal. The next malt I'm going to sample is Dalwhinnie. And among Highland distilleries, you can't get any higher than Dalwhinnie.
It's the highest distillery in Scotland, at over 1,000 feet. Dalwhinnie is Scottish Gaelic for the meeting place. This is where several Highland trails met as drovers took cattle and whisky over the mountains to the bigger markets further south. It's so cold and snowy here that the distillery and village of Dalwhinnie are often cut off in winter. The distillery also acts as a weather monitoring station, and you could say that the malt whisky is as pure as the driven snow. The snow that melts here flows from the Grampians granite mountains over heathery moorlands to meet the malt in magical infusion. The waters they don't take at the highest of Highland distilleries will pick up more heathery, clover-like, flowery notes on their way to the River Spey, whose fertile valley in the northeast has more distilleries than any other stretch of Scotland.
What I thought we might do at this stage is compare the mountain Highlander, Dalwhinnie, with the Speyside Valley dweller, Crag and Moor. Some people would taste them the other way around, but I like it this way. So what do we think of the Dalwhinnie? Again, it's very aromatic, to me with a gentle heather honey aroma. Balanced by a smoky dryness in the finish. And the body's firm but relatively light. It's a very gentle malt, and I think one to arouse the appetite before dinner, an aperitif malt. The Speyside malt, the Crag and Moor, is more complex. I find it elegant with a fragrant, flowery bouquet, almost herbal. And a very smooth body.
As you sip this malt, you'll find that these characteristics develop. You'll notice something new every time. It's one to work on slowly. It doesn't reveal itself immediately. Some malts are like that. They're the ones often favoured by connoisseurs. But we can all be connoisseurs. I suppose you could argue that all malts are for sipping, but this one is a real sipping whisky. The juices of the barley malt develop their own characteristics in fermentation and distillation. All single malts are distilled by the traditional batch process, in a copper vessel resembling a kettle or pot. Every distillery has pot stills of a slightly different shape. It depends on the size of the distillery, the height of the ceilings, and the quirks of the coppersmith or the original distillery manager. In the case of Crag and Moor, the low-ceilinged stillhouse has pot stills with an unusually flat T-shaped top, and they undoubtedly play their part in shaping the character of the whisky.
We've passed the halfway mark in our whisky tour now. It's a good idea to keep each malt by its own bottle so that you can remember which was which. Now we're at Oban, still with the taste of the Highlands, but with a good hint of the islands too.
Oban is in the Western Highlands, where the Grampian Mountains meet the sea, where they meet the Atlantic, in fact. It's a little seaside town huddled around its harbour, and at its heart is its distillery. It's a very small distillery, but it's one of the best known in the Western Highlands. The distillery was founded in 1794, and the town grew around it to become the capital of the Western Highlands and the last mainland stop on the road to the Isles. When the whisky is finally put into the cask, the atmosphere plays a further part in shaping its character. As the casks expand in the warmth of summer and contract in the cool of winter, they breathe in the local atmosphere.
There's a fresh whiff of the sea in this one. It's a more assertive malt. It's got a lot of fruitiness in it too. And some peaty smokiness. For me, it's an after-dinner malt.
From Oban, it's a short hop over the sea to Skye, and to the island's only distillery, Talisker. The island malts are the most assertive. The water for the maltings and distilleries flows over peat, and the whiskies are matured on wild, sea-swept, seaweedy shores.
One taster thought this was lava from the volcanic mountains of Skye, the Coolins. Another said it made steam come out of his ears. Some people say it explodes on the palate. Talisker has always been bottled a little stronger than most malts, at 45.8%. Different malts seem to express themselves better at different strengths, and we have quite a selection of potencies here. The same is true of ages, and Talisker is released at a relatively young and robust 10 years old. There's no perfect age for single malt whisky in general, but there's arguably an optimum age for individual malts. That's why each of the classic malts has its own chosen age. Like people, they reach maturity at different ages. I love the island malts. In Talisker I find a smoky sweetness of aroma, a full flavour and body, and a long, hot, peppery finish. It's a real winter warmer.
For me, the finish of a drink is very important. I want it to linger. I want to know that I've had a drink. In this case, I want to know that I've had a taste of wild, rebellious Skye, the island of Bonnie Prince Charlie. The greatest of malt whisky islands is Islay, with 7 working distilleries set into the seaweedy coastline, including the classic Lagavulin. The sea batters and sprays the windswept coast, and its briny blessing soaks the peat that enwraps much of this mountainous island. From the mountains, the waters plunge down through the peat to steep the malt. The peat itself is cut to fuel the fires that dry the malt. Then the peaty water meets the malt in infusion on the way to becoming whisky. Finally, the casks of whisky breathe in the peaty, seaweedy, salty atmosphere.
Lagavulin. It's the most intense of all Islay malts. peaty, pungent, dry, a real grown-up single malt Scotch. But its uncompromising character hasn't prevented it from becoming extremely popular. Very grown up at 16 years old. This malt has a benefit not only of its Islay character, but of those 16 years in the cask.
The wood used in aging malt whisky is of critical importance. It's always oak, and traditionally sherry casks are used. The casks are first used for the maturation of sherry in the little town of Jerez in the south of Spain, then shipped to Scotland for their encounter with malt whisky. In Scotland, coopers repair and maintain a stock of sherry casks, bowing the wood over the eternal flame. If a cask has been used several times for malt whisky, its ability to impart a sherry taste will have diminished. Used for the first time, it'll be full of sherry character. A gentle malt could be overwhelmed by aging in new sherry casks, whereas the full-bodied Lagavulin is handsomely rounded out by a barrel or two of sherry. From the water flowing from the nearest hill, rocky, peaty, flower-covered, to the differing flavours imparted by the peat local to the maltings, was it heathery, grassy or smoky, to the architecture of the building confronting the coppersmith who made the stills, are they tall or short, fat or slender, to the atmosphere in the maturation warehouse, was it in a sheltered valley or on a rocky shore. These classic malts are shaped at every twist and turn by their own locality, and each is a fine example of its region.
Every one comes from its own home, and I must say, every one has a place in my home. Cheers.